Many women are not prepared for the experience of sex because they've only ever been prepared for obedience or only been prepared to be obedient. And of course, a lot of obedience in relation to sex requires women often to abstain and refrain from having sex. And if you are going to have sex with one man in the context of marriage. And this is something that when you look across religion and culture is encouraged, okay? And often there's very little practical advice, information that is pleasure centered for the woman that is indeed given to women. And there's quite a few, I would say, religious women, women of faith in our community who often ask me questions about how they can actually prepare for sex. What do they need to know? I know the series that I've been doing on the invisible contracts related to sex and women has been really well received. And so I've looked through the comments and the questions that I'm receiving in the DMs and emails. And so what we're going to talk about here is the fact that, yes, it's true quite often that religious women, women of faith, as it were, are often educated, socialized into a form of morality, but not to experience sex and not to definitely be in their authority when it comes to the experience of sex itself. If you're taught to not have sex at all, stay pure, protect your virginity, remain modest, and save yourself into a marriage, absolutely nothing obviously is taught about maybe first time nerves, the importance of communication, okay? And not, and communication beyond waiting maybe for him to bring it up and for him to lead in the conversation and the act. Very little information about arousal and the arousal cycle, what arousal actually can feel like, what might be needed for arousal to even emerge, lubrication, contraception, pain. Okay, because there's this almost accepted idea that sex will be painful for a woman, particularly on her first time. And in actual fact, if you go and do your research, it doesn't have to be painful. And pain is not something that you ever have to endure during sex. Okay, you don't have to. And this really requires, especially if you're abstaining and you're a young woman of faith, etc. This, the onus is not only on you to create the environment and the conditions under which you are not experiencing sex during during sex, and also pacing. What does that look like? How does that contribute to your experience of pleasure during sex? Safety in all the ways. I think one of the things that's often talked about, and I do think some of these ideas about women and sex are quite outdated, quite frankly, because, women are not a monolith. But a lot of the time you'll hear people say that women require emotional connection and emotional safety in order to be aroused, in order to be attracted to a man sexually, in order to engage in the actual sex. Now, that isn't always true. Not every woman's kind of sexual palette is the same, and there doesn't have to be any morality attached to that. There are plenty of women who have sex with men that they are not emotionally connected to, and that includes married women, okay? There are plenty of married couples where they go through periods of time. Sometimes they didn't get married because of love, okay? It is a marriage of convenience, and so that doesn't mean that there's emotional connection when they're engaging in sexual activity. And actually, this, I think, as I said, can be quite outdated and is not helpful for women to understand their sexual palette and operate in pleasure authority, because there is, not everyone needs emotional connection. A level of safety, yes, if you know anything about the nervous system and the way the nervous system operates and functions, there is a need often for safety and presence and self-trust. And that obviously can be contributed to by the person that you may be engaging in sex with and by the overall conditions and environment. But actually that's something that you can internally generate quite often. And so it seems a bit taboo at times. But if you, are having adult conversations with people, people will sometimes acknowledge that they don't always require emotional connection in order to be aroused, in order to be attracted. And when I say people, I mean specifically women, to be attracted to men, to enjoy having sex with men. And I do think some of this kind of, as I say, it might be true of some women, but it's not true of all. And actually this can impact, for example, whether or not you can truly relax and enjoy. Because if you have expectations of yourself around being the good girl, the good woman, that can show up during sexual activity as well, and actually inhibit you in terms of, being able to articulate yourself, operate in pleasure authority, ask for what it is that you like, or you discuss something that you want to explore. The other thing that is seldom taught to young women of faith in particular is consent within marriage and what that means, and the fact that it is a real thing. What pleasure actually feels like, what exploring pleasure could be like. And then the other thing is what to do if you don't want to do it, or you feel afraid, or you feel nervous. I think these are some of the conversations that often women are not prepared for because of a lot of the invisible contracts around sex. And so how can we really expect someone to, succeed in an experience that, quite frankly, when you get married, there is an expectation often that you participate in this experience. If you've ever observed the conversations that occur around, the fact that sex is needed in a marriage, it's needed to maintain a relationship, that the man expects it and needs it, apparently like gas and air, that of course, if you are going to engage in this activity, often women are ill prepared, as I say, to be active participants, to operate, exercise pleasure authority in their own body, and not just turn out to perform for the pleasure of the man. Okay, so obviously, if you've been taught that you are to preserve and protect your body for one man, and that obviously at the point of marriage, therefore, your body belongs to him, because that is a belief, and lots of, especially people from Christian backgrounds, they will cite those scriptures that talk about, your body belonging to your spouse. And therefore, that is the reason why you would engage in sex, to maintain that relationship, even if you are not feeling it in the moment. And so a lot of women absorb these beliefs, and it's reinforced by culture, okay, social media, by conversations that you may hear happening. And so really and truly, it can be probably quite stark to go from not touching your own body, not allowing anybody else to touch your body, not necessarily allowing yourself to think about sex, and not necessarily desiring sex. Some people obviously desire sex before they engage in it, but the truth of the matter is, a lot of the common practices that are encouraged, particularly if you're abstaining, is that, you essentially have to become a corpse in order to make sure that you are showing virtuous purity and modesty, etc. And then, of course, suddenly, after you get married and sign that certificate of marriage, you have to want sex, you have to be available, you can't refuse, apparently, and you have to be a good wife, ergo sexually available and desirous of meeting his needs. So that's an enormous transition psychologically. And of course, some women may struggle with that, because off the bat, you're not necessarily, as I say, coming from a place of pleasure or authority. Or I have known many women, I've been around a lot of women who were virgins before they got married. They may have looked forward to sex because they had certain romantic fantasies in their head about it, and the reality was not that at all. Okay. And so that can also be a disappointment, a bit of a shock, especially if it's not pleasurable necessarily for her. And the thing I think we often forget, especially in more conservative and religious communities, is, well, if you don't educate people, who will? Well, what often happens is that you will be informed and educated, so to speak, by pornography, adult content, maybe friends, trial and error, misinformation, shame, and silence. Okay, so that education simply gets outsourced, because if you don't receive it from an older sister, from your mother, from maybe trusted female friends, and also you're not comfortable talking about it, then of course you are at the behest of your husband, depending upon his knowledge level, skill level, and taste level, because they're not all the same thing. And even if he isn't a virgin, it doesn't mean that you have the same taste sexually. It doesn't mean that he's sexually literate. And so if you don't intentionally educate yourself about something as important as this, someone else will educate you by experience. And that experience could be painful. That experience could be confusing. It might even be anxiety fueling. Okay. And so that's why it's so important for you to exercise pleasure authority. There's two stages. There's bodily autonomy and understanding that and your right to it, but then there's also exercising pleasure authority and not being a passive participant in your own sexual experiences. And the truth of the matter is, when a woman does not understand her own body, does not know her own body, does not occupy her own body sexually, that benefits systems of power. It also really benefits misogynistic men, because uh, if a woman doesn't know what desire feels like, what pain is normal and what isn't, that she can actually communicate, that she can ask questions, that she can slow things down, that sex is meant to be mutual as an experience. It's meant to be mutually fulfilling, not one-sided. Okay. And here's the other thing. Sometimes you will find that older women who may have been living in a certain way, have experienced certain things, it's normal to them. And so actually they may well encourage you or tell you, oh no, that's fine. Sometimes that's just how it goes. If they've never had an orgasm, or they seldom have orgasms, or they're in a situation where, that doesn't happen because maybe their partner is not curious, interested, or invested, they may really encourage you to accept less than what is available to you, especially when you decide to exercise pleasure authority. And so sometimes other women may not be reliable sources of advice and information about this, because it depends on where they're at in their own journey when it comes to their own sexuality. And so education is important, and choosing to do that education in your own time is important. Now, that does not mean you have to obviously engage in vulgar or what you might deem to be inappropriate content. It's not even necessary to have to do that. There are plenty of other ways to become far more literate in your own sexuality, that don't include maybe looking at obviously what you deem to be inappropriate content. Okay, so this is important. Okay, and often I find that a lot of women are looking for permission to be able to explore this, to be able to become more informed, so that they feel more prepared for when they choose to engage in sex. And this doesn't really only apply to women who may not have had sex before. At any point in time as a woman, you can choose to rewrite your sexual story. You can choose to engage in sex or not, because the not is a choice as well. Whether that's celibacy, asexuality, doesn't matter what it is. These are all choices. That is a pleasure authority choice as well. And so you can ask questions. You can say, I'm not comfortable with that. There are plenty of practices that appear to be commonplace. And again, unless you have done your education and informed yourself, you might think you have to engage with them. Someone ejaculating on your face, strangulation, anal sex. These are things that you do not have to engage with. It doesn't matter what the other person prefers. If you don't want to do those things, you don't have to do those things. You don't have to engage in activities that you do not find pleasurable, and maybe even find dignified. You don't feel respected in the course of that activity. You don't have to do it just to please your husband. There is no divine mandate that requires you to do that at all. And I think what's even more annoying is a lot of the times, I shouldn't say, look, people don't like generalizations. There are times where women engage in these things to show willing, okay, to be the good partner that is meeting the needs of her husband. Meanwhile, they've never had an orgasm. Meanwhile, they're not consistently and reliably experiencing pleasure. That kind of asymmetry should not fly. Okay, it should not fly. Really and truly, you should be able to experience pleasure as often as he does. If it's meant to be mutually fulfilling, okay, you should be able to experience pleasure as often as he does. It should be one for one. And it should absolutely be a joint effort and investment in making sure that happens. Okay. And so just because you do get married or you're in a long-term relationship, maybe you do love the person and you feel as though they love you, that does not mean you have to comply with practices and activities you don't want to, you don't find comfortable, and as I say, you're not enjoying. Okay. And so it's really important that you exercise your ability to you exercise pleasure authority. You become more self-authoritative so that you feel like you can speak up. You can freely speak up. And the thing about this is that when you do that, you're able to have full body yeses. It's not just always about saying no. Yes, the practice of saying no is incredibly important, but it also means that when you say yes, you can mean it. Okay. And you can make informed decisions. Now, sometimes people find these conversations very uncomfortable, which is very interesting to me, because if we're adults and we're engaging in this type of activity, whenever and however you choose to engage with it, it requires you to think and function like an adult. Okay. And so that means that you are responsible for informing yourself. Unfortunately, parents, friends, older siblings may not, for various reasons. Like I say, some of these topics are incredibly taboo in certain cultures and environments. And often people often believe that if you're giving people information, then you're therefore giving them permission to engage in certain activities. And that actually is not true. And actually, there is a real safety issue here as well. When you go into these situations completely green, naive, and new and unawares, it's not always a good thing either. And actually, what we do is we, you know, enable people to engage in this kind of activity with their dignity intact, with good self-esteem, with good self-respect, because they're informed and therefore they can prepare, but also they can participate and advocate for themselves. And I think we do young women in particular a real disservice, because when they are not informed properly, it means that they could end up having experiences that could have been avoided. Okay, experiences that might not be very pleasant. And that includes consensual experiences that just may not be very pleasurable, may include pain, and that inability to speak up for yourself. And the thing is that a lot of this stuff around pleasure authority and also locating authority within yourself, it does require you to speak up in the moment. You see, a lot of there's a couple of things I'll say at this point. Often you can practice self-authority outside of sex and in advance of that, right? It shows up in the way you communicate with your friends, setting boundaries, following through on boundaries, the way you conduct yourself, the way you look after your own body. It shows up in money, talking about money, asking for money. So there's other spheres of life in which you can practice self-authority. And therefore, hopefully it enables you to flex that muscle so that when you find yourself in a situation related to sex, you can also speak up for yourself with some ease because you've been doing it from before. And this is really, really important. Okay. And so this starts actually outside of that scenario, and it starts before then. And then also where you really forge your ability to exercise self-authority is in situations that can be tense, in situations where there may be some discomfort, in situations where you're hesitant or worried about how the other person feels about what you're saying. Yeah, because a lot of the time women are really trying to manage a man's ego. They're trying to manage his emotions in the process. And that makes it more difficult because you're basically mollycoddling, hand holding him, whilst at the same time trying to operate and exercise your self-authority. This is why it's really helpful to practice doing it in other spheres and practice doing it before that situation, so that when you're in a moment where it feels tense and uncomfortable and you're worried about that person's response, when your own nervous system is saying, actually, maybe it would be more easier, maybe it would be more comfortable if you didn't speak up and say anything, because you want to maintain the funness of the situation, but except for it's not fun for you. Okay, it's really important that if sex and you view it and you're on the same page as that person, that sex is meant to be mutually fulfilling, mutually pleasurable, then you should be mutually invested, okay, in your pleasure. And so you should be able to speak up and say, I don't like this, I don't want that, I don't want to do this. Actually, I want to do this. I want to explore this. I want to try this. This is what would make me feel good. This requires psychological adulthood. And a lot of the time, what we find is that a lot of women are having sexual experiences that are not pleasurable, that are not enjoyable. And they really struggle at times to articulate that. Not least because, some women have just been ignored, right? They're in relationships where that man is not really interested and definitely is not responding to clear communication about that woman's needs. And so, again, exercising pleasure or authority also means that you do not continue to do things you don't really want to do. Don't continue to have sex with people who are not curious, not invested in your pleasure. Stop doing it. Stop doing it, because sometimes the only thing people understand is consequences, right? Your body is not somebody else's plaything, so to speak, right? Unless you want it to be. If you find that pleasurable and enjoyable, that's fine. But the point is, you do not have to allow your body to be used for somebody else's gratification. You do not have to allow somebody to seek release at the expense of your body when you've clearly communicated what you like and the terms under which you are willing to engage. And I use that phrase deliberately, because a lot of the times you'll hear sometimes even other women and men say, well, no, when it's a loving marriage, God's vision for sex and marriage and all of that stuff, to get you to abdicate your self-authority, to get you to pull back from fully showing up and saying, no, this is what I want, this is what I need. If you still want to engage with my body because you're being satisfied using my body, I also want to be satisfied in this context. I deserve to be satisfied in my own body. And the thing about women, anatomically, we are wonderful beings. You can self-generate pleasure, by the way. Sometimes you don't even need to be touched necessarily by somebody else or even yourself. Okay, it's a wonderful kind of world of pleasure when it comes to a woman's body. And actually, if you are not experiencing pleasure in your own body, what is the point of being there? Really? And so you do not have to keep offering, so to speak, your body up to somebody who has demonstrated actually they are not interested, they're not invested. And by the way, words mean nothing. He can say all the things, oh, okay, how do you, and then the next time he doesn't make any changes. He shows no interest. The next time he does the same thing over and over again. The next time he just rolls over, uninterested in you. You get to speak up for yourself. You get to exercise that pleasure authority. And like I say, sometimes, a lot of the times, the only thing they understand is consequence. That's it. And so, you do not have to keep sacrificing your body, your pH balance, so somebody else can have their fun with your body and you're not enjoying your own body. I genuinely think it's a travesty, quite frankly. And the fact that women can have children and never experience an orgasm or pleasure is wild, right? And keep in mind that preparing yourself from a kind of knowledge or information point of view is not the opposite of being faithful. I think that's a big misconception. Okay, people assume that there are only two options: remain completely sexually ignorant or reject your faith. No, there's other options here, right? You can wait until marriage if you're choosing to, and still prepare. You can prepare emotionally as best you can. You can prepare medically in terms of just making sure you're healthy, understanding your body. The amount of women who've never had, for example, a smear test because they assume that unless you're sexually active, that's not necessary. That's not true, especially if you're getting on in years. Your reproductive and sexual health is very important, and it does require some kind of exploration, maybe an examination, okay, regardless of whether or not you're sexually active. And you can prepare psychologically in the sense that, as I say, when you move to a place of maturity, you're operating in your self-authority in other areas of life that will support you whenever you choose to have your sexual debut, as it were. You can learn about contraception, STI testing, your anatomy, arousal, pelvic floor relaxation. This is a big one for a lot of women who are virgins, for a lot of women who have abstained. You can go and look up the studies which show that there are certain groups of women who really struggle with things like vaginismus. Okay, because, and a lot of this is why I talk about the mind-body connection here and operating in pleasure authority, because actually a lot of the time it is psychological. Your nervous system matters massively. And if you are someone that struggles to speak up for yourself, struggles to say no, struggles to express yourself, take up space, be visible, be perceived, be noticed, be seen, these are all aspects of sex. That is what actually invites pleasure into your body, into your nervous system. It is the openness, the willingness, the ability to be seen and noticed and perceived, to take up space, to be visible. Yeah. So then this is the part of that psychological preparation. it absolutely affects your physical responses as well. Okay, and so you can do research on that, because there are women, you'll find there's a mixture of somatic practices that they start to use in order to help them, okay, to be able to be open to things like penetration. So you might want to learn about lubrication, how to talk about your expectations, consent as well, right? As well as kind of pleasure more. None of those things require you to actually have sex. They simply prepare you as best as possible for that experience when you're going to choose to do it. Okay, this is what psychologically mature adults do. Not sinful people, not rebellious people, not dirty people, not vulgar people. Okay, people, I mean, I was about to say people prepare before becoming parents, but not everybody does. But you get my drift. There are other things that you prepare for: buying a house, getting married, even though this is a part of it, if this is what you're doing. Okay, so it's okay to prepare as best you can for something like this. And arguably, sex can be the most physically and emotionally intimate experience that people engage in, particularly in marriage, if that's your vision for sex as well, if that's the way you see sex. And so, why would you prepare the least for that as a woman, especially given what it requires of you physically, right? You are physically often being entered and penetrated. And that is a embodied experience. It can be an embodied experience. Some people disassociate for various reasons, but the point is, yes, you should prepare for it, talk about it, learn about it, because that will make a material difference to your experience of it, and also your ability to, as I say, assess the experience and think, what do I want to do differently? What do I want to experience differently next time round? Okay, this is why the invisible contract framework exists, because you can personally and privately reflect on the invisible contracts related to sex that you might be obeying, and think about the ways it's governing the decisions that you make and the way you're showing up across the spectrum of life. That is somewhere in the link. It's completely free for you. And so that you can really start to think about how you operate in your self authority and you exercise pleasure authority.